Good morning. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. It's an honor anytime I'm invited to share God's Word, and it's always a privilege to be here with you at Big Canoe Chapel. And my wife Allison and I are so thrilled to be back with so many of our friends that we have missed. And so we have enjoyed reconnecting with so many of you this weekend, and it's great to be with you. I said something in the first service that I was slightly corrected by after in the stand around, and my comment was that husbands don't think that the potluck dinner is the only thing you need to do for your wife on Valentine's Day. Don't think that you're getting off easy by someone else cooking the meat for you. But I do hope you'll be here on Wednesday night. I know it's going to be a great time together, but go ahead and take her out for dinner also, another night that week. Open your Bibles with me, if you would, to the Gospel of Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12, and if you already have that open, I invite you to stand with me as we read together from God's Word. One of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. The people debating were the scribes and the Pharisees amongst themselves. And this particular teacher heard this, and he said, noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked Jesus, of all the commandments, which one is the most important? The most important one, answered Jesus, is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and with all of your strength. And the second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. Well said, teacher, the man replied. You are right in saying that God is one, and that there is no other but him. To love him with all of your heart, and with all of your understanding, and with all of your strength, and your neighbor as yourself is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. And when Jesus saw that the man had answered wisely, he said to him, You are not far from the kingdom of God. And from then on, no one dared ask him any more questions. You can be seated, please. Probably like many of you in the room, when my children were younger, they played soccer. And one of mine played up into high school. Most of them just, when they were 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, that kind of thing. And so I remember being at a soccer game. I think my son was on the 6 or 7-year-old team, but there was another little game going on right before his, and it was the 4 and 5-year-olds. And so we had gotten there a little bit early, and I was standing around watching the 4 and 5-year-olds play soccer. Now, if you've ever watched 4-year-olds play soccer, it's a bit entertaining. Because most of them have no idea what's going on. They just are running up and down the field, and it's a funny thing to watch. But at this particular game, let's just say there was a father in the crowd who was taking the whole thing much too seriously. And it was obvious that his son was on the field, and his son's name was Norman. Now, I didn't know Norman, but Norman's name was being called out over and over and over again, and not in a positive light. I could hear this father say, Run faster, Norman. Kick the ball, Norman. Play harder, Norman. No matter what Norman did, it simply didn't seem to be the right thing at all. And I stood back, not knowing these people, not knowing the father or any of the children involved, as a simple observer. And as I stood back watching, and it was pretty obvious which one was Norman, even though he didn't have his name on his shirt, but as I stood back watching, I watched little Norman's shoulders slump just a little bit more with every comment from the sideline that his father called out. Finally, the other team was able to score a goal, which is quite an event in 4-year-old soccer. But the other team scored a goal, and which meant everyone was on one end of the field. And so as they all ran back to the middle of the field for the next kickoff, little Norman was just kind of wandering around, head down, dejected. And all of a sudden, we heard it come again. "Get with your team, Norman," came the call from his father. Now, at that point, to be perfectly honest, I was infuriated. And I really wanted to go have a little man-to-man chat with that father, but I figured it wasn't wise to do so, so I turned instead and walked away, shaking my head all the time. And as I walked away, there was no other thought that came into my head than this: I am so glad that our Heavenly Father doesn't do that to us. That He doesn't constantly criticize us. He doesn't constantly yell at us. He doesn't constantly berate us. And as we see this scene, we are reminded of the relationship that we are called to have with our Heavenly Father. Let's set the scene, because it's always important when we find ourselves looking at the life of Jesus to understand the bigger picture. What's going on here? So let's understand, this is taking place near the end of Jesus' ministry. He has been working and serving and healing and ministering and doing all of the things, working the miracles and preaching and teaching for almost 3 full years now. And let's understand, these Pharisees and Sadducees and religious scribes, they had tried and tried and tried to corner him, to trap him with trick questions, and it never worked. He always had the right answer. And once again, it's almost as if it's a moment of last-ditch desperation. They decide to ask one more question. Now let's understand, again, part of the setting in this is to understand the people who are asking the question, because they had a very different way of looking at God than Jesus did. And you know, we all have grown, or most of us at least, grew up attending church, but what that means is many different kinds of churches. And in those many different kinds of churches, we developed different views of God and different views of what it meant to be a Christian or to live a Christian life. In the ways of these scribes and teachers and Pharisees, for them, it was just about following rules. They had a long list of rules, and as long as they followed the rules, they were serving God or living their life in a godly way. Now, let's understand just how many rules they had. There were 613 rules that had to be followed. And let's understand, these weren't all big rules. Some of them were tiny little things. In other words, you could violate a rule without even really thinking twice about it. It might just be a very minor thing. And in these 613 rules, there were 248 of them that were positive. In other words, these are the things you must do. And there were 365 of them that were negatives. In other words, thou shalt not, whatever. And often, they would argue among themselves as to which rule was the most important. And so, in a way, they thought they could once again corner Jesus. They come to him and they said, of all the commandments, in other words, of all the rules that we have to follow, which single one is more important than any other? And Jesus responded with what was known as the Shema. And the Shema was exactly what he quoted, based on 2 different scriptures, Deuteronomy 6:4-5, and Leviticus 19:18, when he said, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. You see, they weren't exactly sure what he was going to say, but when he answered, it was brilliant. Because all he said was, all of these other rules that you're following are somewhat pointless if you're not following these 2. And this was the heart of the matter. He said, really, what God expects from you is 2 things: to love him and to love your neighbor. That's what it boils down to. It sounds simple enough, but yet, as so many things did with Jesus, it was a little more challenging than it might appear on the surface. What does it mean to love God with all of your heart? Well, we ironically happen to be here at Valentine's Day. And what's going to happen? So many of us are going to go out and we're going to buy a card and it's going to have hearts on it. Or we're going to, buy a box of chocolate that's going to look like a heart or anything, but it's all about the heart. And we will say, I love you with all of my heart to the person who is our sweetheart. We're going to say, I love you with all of my heart. Remember back to that time when you first met the one that you are now spending your life with. Remember the tingle and the butterflies and all of those kinds of things. And we would say, I love you with all my heart. Why is that? Why would we say those things? Because the heart is the seat of our affection. And those in this day and time understood this is where our affection for someone or something comes from. And what we long for the most and who we most desire to please. So when we love God with all of our heart, our desire is that we are living our lives in a way that we want to be pleasing to Him. We want to live our life in such a way that He is honored and glorified Him. And we're going to talk about the other aspects of that. But when was the last time that we do this between us as individuals. A number of you this morning have given me a hug and said, welcome back. We've missed you. I love you. We say that to people. When was the last time you shared your love for God with Him? And just said, Father, I just love you so much. I am so deeply grateful for the love you have for me, and I want to share back with you the love I have for you. Does it mean we cannot love anyone or anything else? No, we can love other people, but the love we have for anyone else other than God should pale in comparison. Why? Because we cannot divide our affection. We cannot divide our affection between God and anything else. Remember what Jesus said? You can't love God and money. You may say, but I need money. He said, that's fine. You just can't love it in comparison with how you love God. It may sound a little bit unreasonable, but stop and think about it from this angle. How would you feel if your spouse came home and said, honey, I really love you, and I love spending time with you. I love sharing my life with you, but I just want you to know there's someone else that I've fallen in love with, and I want to be able to spend time with them as well. Probably wouldn't go over very well. Why? Because you can't split your affection. You have one person to whom you are devoted. And in this same way, we have one that we are devoted to, and we are called upon Him to love Him with all of our hearts. Pastors are called to be involved in all kinds of different domestic situations, many of which we would rather not know about. People feel obligated to tell their pastor everything about their lives. And many times it's way more information than we wanted. Such was the case with a young man, an older pastor had performed a wedding for a young couple. He had walked them through all of their premarital counseling. And then the husband, after the honeymoon, a few weeks later, came back into the pastor's office. And he sat down in front of the pastor and he said, preacher, I just don't know how much more I can take. I just don't know if I want to live with this woman. And the pastor said, now listen, have you already forgotten you promised a few weeks ago to take her for better or for worse? The young man said, I know I did, but she's worse than I took her for. But we are still called to love God with all of our heart. We're also called to love God with all of our soul. Now, this is the seat of your will, of what you truly want to do, of truly what is motivating and driving you. And you see, we sometimes hear people say, no, I don't know about that. I want to love God, but I want to still do what I want to do. In other words, I want to be able to be motivated by my own desires, but I still want to kind of have God off on the side. And that's not at all what is being called for here. We are being called to be motivated to what we do out of our love for God. Now, let me give you an example, and I got in a bit of trouble with my sweet wife a while ago when I shared this, but my wife loves to shop. She does. But she also loves for me to shop with her. Now, am I as excited about shopping with her as she is about me going with her? Let's put it this way. I love to go to the stores that have a chair for the husband. And when they don't, I tell them that they need to get one. But I love going shopping with my wife. Why? Because I love her. And I know it means something to her. And I know she enjoys having me with her. And even though it might not be the top of my list, the things that I want to do it because I love her and I know it means something to her. I am motivated to do something because of love. Wives, how about you? How many times, ladies, have you watched something on television just because it was what your husband wanted to watch, when you really couldn't have cared less? Sure. Why did you do it? Because you knew it was something he wanted, and you love him, and you wanted to do that for him. This is exactly what Jesus is talking about when he talks about loving him with all of your soul. You loving with what motivates you to want to do things for him, and you do those things out of the overflow of your love. Jesus said, love God so much that we will gladly do what he wants us to do. Thirdly, he calls us to love God with all of our mind. A couple of different things there. One is our attitude. I always tell people in counseling, there is one thing in your life that you have full control over, and only one. You don't have full control over your health because you never know when something's going to pop up. You don't have full control over anyone else in your life. You don't have control over your circumstances, but you do have control over your attitude. You and you alone control your attitude. And this is part of loving God with all of your mind, is having a godly attitude. Allowing God to control the perspective I have when I see things around me or when I see people around me. Because let's understand, not all people are wonderful and loving and friendly, are they? In the conference that we had yesterday, I shared about being at a grocery store not too long ago, and when I got up to the cashier, I had a lot of groceries, and there was no one to bag the groceries. So the lady is scanning the groceries, and the groceries are starting to pile up at the end of the thing. And I thought to myself, well, I'll just bag my own groceries. So I went around to the end, and I'm picking items up, and I'm setting it off in the thing. And one of the items I had was in a glass jar. To be honest, I can't exactly remember what it was, but it was in a glass jar. Well, as I picked it up and started to put it in the bag, it slipped out of my hand, and it hit the floor, and it busted. And the cashier went, "Oh, I hate it when people do that." And let's be honest, my attitude wasn't immediately what it should have been. By the grace of God, I didn't unleash what was in my mind. But you see, that is an example. I didn't have any control over what this woman was going to say or do. I was solely in control of my own attitude or my own reaction to what happened. So if I am loving God with all of my mind, it's all about how I am perceiving things. It's also how I am acting and reacting in those ways. Second part of this is my intellect or my knowledge. We intimately love or intimately know those whom we love. I dare say, as I look around the room, let me ask this. How many of you in the room have been married 50 years or longer? Look, that's amazing. That's amazing. I dare say for those, and this is not exclusive to that group, but for those who raised your hands, there is not one thing about your spouse that you don't know. You know the good, the bad, and the ugly, and everything else in between. And you love them, and because you love them, you want to know more about them. You know, there's something to be said about our intellect and our knowledge being used for God. My dad was a simple man. He was not highly educated. He had a little 2-year college degree. He wasn't a successful businessman. He was very faithful in serving God. His name will never be written in lights or anything. He was never well known or anything like that. But he loved Jesus, and he loved to talk to people about the Jesus that he loved. And he came home from a trip one time, and he told me the story. He said he was on an airplane, and because I knew he had gone away for the weekend. He was on an airplane, and sitting beside him were 2 businessmen who were Japanese. And he had opened his Bible and was reading his Bible on a plane, as he did quite often. And he was just sitting there reading, and one of the men struck up a conversation with him and said, "What are you doing?" And my dad said, "Well, I'm reading my Bible." And he entered into a conversation about Christianity and about the Bible and all kinds of things. And finally, one of these men, who were clearly not familiar very much with Christianity, said to my father, he said, "What does Jesus mean to you?" And my father said, "Everything." And the man said, "But what if you die and realize that none of it was true?" My father replied, "Then I will have walked with Christ all of my life, and I will have lost nothing." He said, "What are you going to do when you die and realize that you were wrong?" You see, our love for God, our devotion to God should be our everything. It should be all-encompassing and all-consuming. Thirdly, he says, love God with all of our strength. The question is, this is what motivates me to do things, to be involved in doing. We are all motivated to do things. For those of us who are still working, we are motivated to go to work because we need a paycheck. Or we are motivated to clean the house because it needs to be cleaned. Peter the apostle was with Jesus and after the resurrection, and Jesus said, "Peter, do you love me?" He said, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." But Jesus didn't stop there, did he? What did he say? "Feed my sheep." Put your faith into action. Don't just love me. Live out that love through what you do. And if we do love him, we will want to love him with all of our strength. But then he added on the passage from Leviticus where it says, we are to love our neighbor as ourselves. This should be the single most natural outflow of our love for God, that we are so loved by him that we want to love our neighbor. Now let's be honest and say this. It's easy to love neighbors who love us back. It's very easy. But what did it say in 1 John? 1 John says this, 2:9. Anyone who claims to be in the light but hates his brother is still in the darkness. Basically, the Apostle John said this, don't talk to me about how much you love God if you can't love your brother. It's as simple as that. But who is our neighbor? Are there any exclusions here? Do you say, well, what about that person? Or what about someone from that background? Or what about this or that? Jesus doesn't give any exclusion clauses here. He doesn't say, except for. In fact, we know from the story about the Good Samaritan, the parable of the Good Samaritan that Jesus taught in Luke chapter 10, he said the man fell in the ditch and was beaten up by robbers, and they left him there, and then there were 3 people came by. a scribe and a Pharisee, and finally a Samaritan, a man who was hated and despised by the Jews. They wouldn't even speak to a Samaritan, much less be touched by a Samaritan, much less be cared for by a Samaritan. But at the end of the parable, Jesus turned to the one who had asked him the question of who was his neighbor, and he said, which one of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? And the expert of the law, and I have to try to, in my mind, to picture this, seeing the expert of the law hang his head and sort of quietly say, the one who had mercy on him. And then what did Jesus say? Go and do likewise. No exclusions, no exceptions, no buts, no ifs. Just go and do likewise. Our love for God must be exemplified by our love for our neighbor. And how are we called to love our neighbor? Exactly as we love ourselves. Now, that's a term you don't think about a lot because you may say, I'm not quite sure how much I love myself. When I look in the mirror, I may not necessarily be crazy about everything that I see. I may wish I had more of this or less of that or whatever. That's not what we're talking about here. To love one's neighbor as oneself means I love myself, and you do too. In just a few minutes, it's going to be lunchtime, and what are we all going to do? We're going to eat. Why? Because our bodies are hungry. I love my body, so I'm going to give it what it needs. If we go outside and it's raining, we're going to put up an umbrella. Why? Because I want to cover my body. I want to protect it from the weather. If it's cold, I want to put on a warm coat. If it's hot, I want to take that coat off. I love my body. I give it everything it needs, and I don't argue with it. We are called to love our neighbor in that exact same way. Love our neighbor exactly as we love ourselves. You know, many in this room, you've walked on this earth longer than I have, but yet I'm starting to reach a point at 63 where I begin to think about things that are going to happen at the end of my life. And sometimes I stop and think, what do I want to be remembered for? When I stand before God, what do I want to be remembered for? And as I thought about this passage, I thought, you know what? There's probably a lot of things that we may be remembered for. And I don't know about you. I can't speak for you. But I want to be remembered as someone who loved too much rather than someone who loved too little. If I'm going to be judged at all by God, I want it for being one who loved too much, because I don't believe we're ever going to be criticized for that. But I believe we may for loving too little. Let's pray together.